Thomas returned home as dusk had already engulfed the street that framed their quiet, serene neighborhood. The car stopped gently in front of the house, and he, tired but pleased with the completion of the project, got out, glancing at the windows. The light in the kitchen was on, and it gave him a familiar feeling of comfort. But something was wrong. Maybe it's silence, maybe there's something in the air. He entered the house, greeted by silence and the smell of fresh dinner. Usually, on such occasions, Selina would come out to meet him, hug him, and then they would have dinner together, discussing his trip and her affairs. But she wasn't in sight today. Thomas frowned, leaving his suitcase in the hallway.
Selina. Met.
There was no answer, just a soft rustle somewhere on the second floor. Thomas went into the living room, looked around, then headed to the kitchen. Dinner was on the table, but he was alone. Selina had obviously prepared everything for his return, but she herself was not in sight. He walked around the house, looked into their bedroom, and finally went upstairs, where he assumed she might be. When he got up, he saw light coming from the half-open door of Marcus's bedroom.
Marcus, are you home?
The door creaked open, and his son appeared in front of him. Marcus looked strange. His eyes seemed to avoid Thomas's gaze. His lips were compressed into a thin line. The room smelled heavy and aloof, and although Marcus looked calm, there was something different about his behavior.
Hello, yes, I'm home.
Thomas nodded, but felt that something was wrong. Marcus didn't show his usual enthusiasm. Even his tone of voice sounded harsh and somehow strained.
Is everything okay?
Marcus looked away, then met his father's gaze for a second, but there was something in his eyes that Thomas couldn't decipher.
Yes, it's fine. I'm just tired. There were trainings, then I met with friends. How are you?
Thomas knew it was pointless to talk to him right now. Marcus was clearly not in the mood for conversation. He frowned slightly, but did not insist, only nodded in response.
Dinner in the kitchen, if you want. I'll go downstairs.
Marcus just nodded and closed the door, and Thomas walked slowly down the stairs, thinking about his son's behavior. Something was definitely wrong. When he entered the kitchen, Selina finally appeared in the doorway. She looked even more strange than Marcus' tense shoulders, pursed lips, and eyes that didn't meet his gaze. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine.
Are you hungry? I made dinner. How was the trip?
Thomas leaned back in his chair, watching her with some concern. Her voice was calm, but there was a falseness in it that she seemed to be trying to hide behind her usual solicitude.
The trip went well, but... Selina, you look worried. Has something happened?
She froze for a moment, her hand hovering over the table as if she was about to say something, but then she crumpled up the words and cast a brief glance at Thomas.
No, it's okay, Thomas. I'm just tired.
Thomas narrowed his eyes. Her answer was too hasty, too simple for him to believe it. He knew her too well not to notice her tension. An unpleasant suspicion arose inside him. He got up from the table and came closer to her, putting his hand on her shoulder. She tensed, as if his touch burned her.
Selina, if something is wrong, you can tell me. I'm here, you know that.
She took a sharp breath and turned away, as if she was afraid that Thomas's gaze would read her secret thoughts too deeply. Silence filled the kitchen, and Thomas realized he wasn't going to get the truth out of her right now. At that moment, he felt alone in his own home, surrounded by secrets that were clearly weaving around him, but were not yet available. Selina finally muttered something unintelligible about needing to rest and headed upstairs, leaving Thomas alone in the kitchen. He slowly sat down at the table, not knowing what to think. Rings of misunderstanding and hidden emotions were slowly closing around him. The next day, Thomas decided not to immediately contact Marcus or Selina. He knew that if he started pushing, things could only get worse. The situation was too tense to break, so he chose a wait and see tactic, watching both of them, and noticing how they tried to avoid each other. But one thing was becoming clear: something had obviously changed in the house. Selina spent more and more time in the garden or in the kitchen, although usually when Thomas returned, she tried to be with him. It was as if she was looking for any excuse not to spend time with him, and that worried him. He could see her eyes constantly searching for something outside his field of vision, as if she was afraid to look into his eyes. Marcus, on the other hand, began to leave more often for training or to visit friends, although he usually behaved more relaxed, especially in his absence. Thomas felt that his son was avoiding him, and it was very annoying. Marcus had always been closed, but now this closure was different. There was a tense spring in him, as if something inside him was ready to explode. On the third day after Thomas returned, everything became even more obvious. Selina, as usual, spent the day outside, trying not to cross paths with her husband, and returned to the house for dinner only late in the evening. Marcus was at home, but locked himself in his room, as had become his habit in recent weeks. Thomas could no longer contain his suspicions. He knocked on the door of Marcus's room, but there was no answer.
Marcus, we need to talk.
The silence outside the door was deafening, but after a few minutes the door slowly opened and his son appeared in front of him with a frozen, tense face. Thomas met his gaze, and this time he didn't look away. There was an internal struggle in their views, and Thomas was determined to get to the truth.
What do you want to talk about?
Thomas tensed, his suspicions only heightened by his son's icy tone. He took a deep breath to calm himself and took a step closer.
You're avoiding me. You're avoiding Selina. What's happening? You can tell me.
Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze getting even tougher.
I'm not avoiding anything. I have my own things to do, my training, my friends. You always have a job, you're always away. So that's fine.
Thomas chuckled. He knew Marcus was smart and could hide his feelings, but that didn't convince him. He felt that there was more than just a misunderstanding between his son and Selina.
Listen, Marcus. I understand that something has changed. And you know that it's not just about your training. I see the way you look at Selina, the way she looks at you. If something is going on, you better tell me now before things go too far.
Marcus froze, his eyes narrowed with anger, but there was also a flicker of fear in them. Selina couldn't remember the last time she felt calm. Every step through the house, every look Thomas gave her burned inside. Evenings that had once brought peace were now a source of torment. Thomas was beginning to suspect something. She could feel it. His eyes, usually soft and kind, seemed strained to her now, as if he was trying to read her mind. Selina stood in the kitchen, pushing an empty cup of tea back and forth on the table, unable to concentrate. Thoughts of Marcus and their last meeting literally tore her apart. Guilt, heavy as a stone, weighed on my heart, and the same thought was constantly spinning in my head. Thomas knows. He feels everything. She couldn't sleep for several nights in a row. Every time Thomas lay down next to her in bed, her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed like it was about to jump out of her chest. But not because of him. No, all this nervousness had something else to do with it, something she tried not to think about, but which inevitably popped up in her mind every time she closed her eyes. Marcus, his face, his eyes, which increasingly lingered on her longer than they should have. She was attracted to him with such force that even trying to get away from these thoughts led to the opposite result. Despite her best efforts, the guilt did not abate. A sudden knock on the counter interrupted her train of thought. Thomas entered the kitchen. His movements were abrupt, and there was a slight tension on his face.
You've become quite detached. Is everything okay?
Selina shuddered, as if she had been caught in the act, and quickly lowered her eyes to the cup, hoping that he would not notice her excitement. Yes, I'm just tired. A lot of housework. But that was only half the truth. She was afraid that Thomas would feel her anxiety, this endless internal conflict that was becoming unbearable for her. He was her husband, her rock, the man she had once felt safe with. But now that feeling was fading, leaving behind only pain and tension. Thomas walked slowly over to her, sat down opposite her and, looking at her intently, asked,
Selina, I've known you for a long time. You're not just tired. It's like you're afraid of something. I can see it in your eyes. You can tell me what's going on.
His words pierced her heart. He was right. She was afraid. I was afraid of what I couldn't control myself. She was afraid that her feelings for Marcus, which she was trying to suppress, would become obvious to Thomas. I was afraid of what would destroy everything. You're making something up for yourself, Thomas. It's okay.
Selina, please. I just want to understand. We haven't really talked for a long time. I feel like you're shutting me out.
These words only intensified her inner torment. Selina couldn't look him in the eye. How could she hide the truth when he was talking to her so directly and honestly? But the truth was too scary. She would have ruined everything. Later that day, Selina found herself in the garden again. The place that had once brought her peace now seemed alien to her. Even when she tried to focus on her usual job of transplanting plants, thoughts of Marcus kept coming back. She hated herself for it. Every time she allowed herself to think about him, the same wild mixture of fear and attraction returned to her. She clearly remembered how they had bumped into each other in the hallway a few days ago. It was such an ordinary event, but their gazes lingered on each other for too long. She could have said it was just her imagination, but her body said otherwise. Her heart pounded harder when she felt his proximity, and instead of pulling away, she felt an inexplicable desire to be with him. It was wrong, but it's too real.
It's just an attraction. It's just a fantasy. I can't afford to think about it.
But it was more than just a fantasy. It was something real that she couldn't deny. She felt that every day her attraction to Marcus grew stronger, even though her mind screamed that it was wrong.
God, how could I have gone so far?
Her fingers were clutching the stem of the plant, and she didn't even notice how she slightly cut herself on the sharp edge of the leaf. Selina winced in pain and looked at her hand. Blood slowly flowed down her finger, and this moment became like a sign for her. Everything she did, everything she thought, hurt her, destroyed her from the inside out. Selina understood that she was on the verge of disaster, and she could no longer ignore it. That evening, Thomas asked her to talk. He was clearly more persistent than usual, and this made Selina even more stressed. Dinner was held in silence, although they usually talked, discussed the day, plans for the near future. But now even the simplest words seemed impossible.
Selina, let's talk.
She was sitting at the table, sorting through the salad on her plate, unable to answer him right away.
About what?
About us. About what has been happening lately. You're not the same person you were before. I can't turn a blind eye to this. You've become a stranger. I can't figure out what's wrong with you.
Selina felt her heart sink. Those words were so direct and painful that she couldn't hold his gaze.
Thomas, you don't understand anything.
So explain it. I want to understand. I feel like you're hiding something. I see you avoiding me. I feel it every time you're around.
Selina couldn't stand this interrogation any longer. Her soul was torn between the desire to confess and the fear of losing everything she and Thomas had built.
I'm confused.
Confused? In what? Selina, if it's something important, I want to help. I'm always here for you.
Selina knew that he was sincere, but this only increased her suffering. She would like to tell him the truth, to tell him about her feelings for Marcus, but that would be a disaster. Selina was afraid that if she told him, she would lose him forever. And not just Thomas, but everything that once made her life normal. The next morning, Selina was back in the kitchen, trying to distract herself from her thoughts, when Marcus came into the house. He didn't know she was here, so he looked relaxed. But as soon as their eyes met, the air in the room immediately became thick, as if soaked with electricity. Their eyes lingered on each other again a little longer than they should have. And again that feeling returned, a mixture of guilt and something else she was afraid to admit.
Hello. You're up early.
Yes, I couldn't sleep. Marcus froze, as if trying to decide whether to continue the conversation, but instead took a step closer, which only increased the tension. You've changed. Those words pierced her like a knife. He also noticed her inner turmoil. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed like Marcus. I have to hear this. She couldn't look him in the eye, knowing that she was standing on the edge of a precipice from which she would not be able to get out.
I haven't changed. It's you. You've changed.
She took a step back, trying to avert her eyes, but Marcus didn't back down. His closeness scared her, but even more scared was her own desire to be with him. She couldn't understand it, but emotions were raging inside her that were stronger than her mind.
Maybe so. But we both feel it.
His words hung in the air. Selina understood that something was going on between them, but she couldn't afford to accept it. She was his father's wife, and these feelings were unacceptable. But Marcus was still there, his gaze becoming more and more piercing. Her head was spinning with thoughts, and she abruptly turned away, unable to withstand this tension.
Don't. Marcus, this is wrong. We can't do this.
Marcus froze, his face serious. He knew she was right, but at that moment it didn't matter anymore. Thomas couldn't take it anymore. Weeks of observations, strange changes in Selina and Marcus' behavior, the intense glances they exchanged when they thought he wasn't noticing all this accumulated in his head, like a thick, indistinct shadow growing every day. At first he tried to justify what was happening, trying to convince himself that these were just temporary difficulties. Perhaps this is the result of their unsettled family life or his frequent trips. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became something was wrong, and it was no longer possible to pretend that everything was okay. Every time Thomas returned home after a business trip, he was greeted not by the usual warmth, but by a strange feeling of remoteness and something hidden. Selina became more withdrawn, as if she was trying to avoid him. Her eyes no longer sparkled with joy at the sight of her husband, and their conversations became more and more brief and formal. It tormented him. With each new attempt to understand what was going on, his inner discomfort increased, and Selina's answers only confused him even more. But if with Selina his anxiety was more related to emotional coldness, then with Marcus everything looked different. The son, who had always been difficult and at times secretive, now began to behave as if he was hiding not only from his father, but also from himself. Marcus began to leave the house more and more often, avoiding long conversations with his father, returning late, and in recent days he stopped appearing at dinners altogether. When Thomas tried to talk to him, Marcus waved him off, offering superficial excuses. But it was too much. Thomas could no longer stand by and remain silent. There came a moment when he was ready to find out everything. Watching his son, he felt that every day he was becoming more and more withdrawn into himself. At first, Thomas thought it might be related to his personal problems, perhaps with friends or studies, but every day he became more and more convinced that it wasn't just that. There was a feeling of something invisible but heavy in the house, which invisibly connected all three of them. One evening, Thomas returned home earlier than usual and saw Marcus, out of habit, quickly heading to his room. But this time Thomas decided not to wait another minute. He was determined to find out what was going on. Going upstairs, he stopped in front of the door of his son's room. Holding his breath, Thomas stared at the door for a few moments, as if waiting for some sign that would confirm his correctness or dispel his suspicions. But there were no signs, only silence, oppressive and oppressive. He knocked, but there was no answer. Thomas felt a growing irritation inside him. The son was not going to open it, and this only added fuel to the fire of his doubts. Thomas, no longer holding back his anger, abruptly opened the door and stepped inside. Marcus was sitting on the edge of the bed with his head bowed, but his face was not visible. Only the tense shoulders betrayed his inner state. This image of his son only increased Thomas' inner anxiety. At first, there was a heavy silence in the room. Marcus didn't seem to expect such a drastic intrusion, but made no attempt to resist or leave the room. Thomas watched his son for a few seconds, trying to figure out what was behind his silence. Then he took a step forward and said in a firm but calm voice, "We need to talk." Marcus didn't look up, but Thomas noticed his body stiffen. This tacit resistance of his son further fueled his suspicions. It was impossible to avoid this conversation any longer, and Marcus knew it. Thomas sat down on the chair opposite his son, keeping his eyes on his face, trying to catch at least some hint of what was going on. It took a few more moments before Marcus, still sighing heavily, raised his head and met his father's gaze. Thomas saw something in his eyes that he had never expected: fear. This moment discouraged him. Thomas expected to see irritation or isolation, but not fear. What could possibly frighten his son so much? Thomas knew that there was something much more serious involved than he had previously thought. "What's going on? What is it?" he asked, trying not to raise his voice, although the internal tension was growing by the second. "Why are you avoiding me and Selina? Why did you stop coming to dinner? What happened?" Marcus turned away, as if trying to evade the question, but Thomas was not going to back down. It wasn't just stubbornness. He felt that if he didn't get the truth now, the situation would only get worse. "I can't take your silence anymore," Thomas continued. "I'm your father, and I deserve to know what's going on with you. Why are you acting like this?" Marcus clutched his temples with his hands, as if trying to keep his head from exploding with emotions that were bubbling inside. Finally, he parted his lips and said softly, but in a hollow voice, "You don't understand anything." These words infuriated Thomas. Doesn't he understand? How can he understand anything if Marcus has been silent and hiding from everyone for so long? Thomas felt anger rising inside him, but he tried to hold it back. This was not the time for shouting. "Then explain it to me," Thomas replied coldly. "I'm not asking you to tell me everything at once, but at least tell me what's wrong with you. What happened?" Marcus froze, his hands clenched into fists, and Thomas noticed how his breathing became more ragged. It seemed that he was about to snap, and this tension was growing with every second. "You have no idea how difficult this is," Marcus finally said, his voice full of pain and disappointment. "I can't explain it to you. You won't understand." With these words, he jumped out of bed, began to walk nervously around the room, not knowing how to express what was bubbling inside him. Thomas felt that something very important was close, but he couldn't reach the truth. He could see that Marcus was in deep internal conflict, but the reason remained unclear. "If you don't tell me what's going on, how can I help?" Thomas tried to calm down, getting up from his chair and taking a step towards his son. "I see that something is bothering you. You can trust me. Whatever it is, we can handle it." Marcus suddenly stopped, as if those words had hit him. He turned to his father, and a mixture of anger and despair was reflected on his face. "Do you really think you can handle this?" he blurted out, casting a look of pain at his father. "It's not something you can help with. It's not just a problem, it is. Everything is out of control." Thomas took a step back, startled by the force with which Marcus uttered the last words. He could see that he was on the verge of a breakdown, but he couldn't figure out what exactly was pushing him into this state. It felt like Marcus was hiding something so heavy that he couldn't even say it out loud. Out of control, Thomas asked, "What are you talking about?" But Marcus didn't answer. He stood like a cornered animal, ready to either run away or attack. Thomas felt that the situation was becoming dangerous not physically, but emotionally. Something destructive was maturing inside his son, and it was ready to break out. Thomas continued to stand in front of him, not knowing what to do next. The fear in Marcus's eyes only intensified, and Thomas realized that he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. but he still couldn't figure out what caused this condition. Thomas was ready to hear anything: problems with studies, drugs, something else, but what he saw now was beyond his assumptions. Marcus was on the verge of confessing, but still didn't take the last step. Selina felt that her life was rapidly losing ground. Every day seemed like another step towards an inevitable collapse that could not be prevented. Her relationship with Marcus had long since crossed the boundaries she had set for herself. She knew Thomas wasn't stupid, and despite his best efforts to remain calm and patient, he was beginning to suspect something was amiss. But what is he capable of? How long would he be able to tolerate her detachment, her strange and awkward attempts to save face in front of him? Her guilt was eating away at her from the inside, like an acrid poison spreading through her veins. As she went deeper into this feeling, she gradually began to realize that she could no longer hide behind a lie. Every time Thomas entered the room, her body tensed and her gaze shifted away. She couldn't stand his close attention, and every question he asked, even the most innocent, was filled with hidden meaning for her. Selina felt that something was about to happen. Her inner world was on the verge of destruction, and something had to be done. Her feelings for Marcus were growing like a dark secret river that was imperceptibly but inexorably washing away all her previous beliefs. She couldn't pretend anymore that it was just a minor infatuation or a temporary mental fog. It was deeper, stronger, and worst of all, beyond her control. With every glance at Marcus, with every appearance in the house, her inner world was bursting at the seams. She could feel her affection for Marcus becoming irresistible, her thoughts caught up in this forbidden feeling that she couldn't get rid of. Selina understood that her affection for him went beyond the bounds of what was allowed, and every day it became more and more difficult for her to suppress this feeling. But a lie. Lying became her constant companion. Lying to Thomas, who didn't deserve such betrayal, and lying to herself that she was still able to control what was happening. Her life had become a maze from which she could not find a way out. The more she tried to hide her feelings, the more they became visible to everyone around her, especially for Thomas. Selina began to notice that Thomas was asking more and more questions, and although they seemed innocent at first glance, she understood that suspicion lurked in every word he said. He knew her too well, and one look was enough for him to know that something had happened. Not immediately, but gradually she realized that she could no longer hold all this pain in herself. One day, when she woke up early in the morning and saw Thomas sleeping next to her, she realized that she could no longer continue this game. She couldn't lie to him anymore, the man who trusted her more than anyone in her life. Selina thought for a long time about how to tell him the truth. How can you admit that you betrayed a man who meant so much to you? Her heart clenched with fear every time she even tried to formulate her feelings in her mind. But the truth was stronger. She knew that if she didn't do it now, she would continue to destroy their lives, slowly and inexorably, until everything finally collapsed. That day came unexpectedly. Thomas returned home after another business trip, and as soon as he crossed the threshold, Selina felt that she could no longer hide her pain. She watched him, seeing how he was trying to behave as usual, asking about her day, telling her about his trip, sharing plans for the weekend. But something in his tone and demeanor was different. Thomas clearly felt that something was wrong, but as always he tried not to force things, giving Selina the space to open her thoughts to him herself. They were sitting at dinner, and every piece of food seemed to her like an invisible lump stuck in her throat. Thomas was telling her about a new deal he had made at work, but Selina barely heard him. Her thoughts were far from this conversation. She was struggling with herself, deciding how to start a conversation. Every minute dragged on like an hour, and she was about to leave the table when Thomas suddenly stopped talking and looked at her with a seriousness that aroused even more fear in her. He clearly saw her inner torment, and she knew that he needed only one word to understand what was going on. At that moment, she decided that this was the end. She couldn't hide behind that mask anymore. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed the whole world could hear its thudding. Selina felt her chest constrict as she began to speak. It wasn't an instant admission. The words came out slowly, as if with each new phrase she had cut off a piece of her soul. She couldn't tell Thomas directly that there were feelings between her and Marcus, that her heart wasn't bursting with love for her husband, but with passion for his son. She couldn't say those terrible words out loud. But instead she started small. She told how difficult it had been for her lately, how she felt lonely, how their family life had become empty and joyless. Thomas listened intently, his face becoming more and more tense, but he did not interrupt. He wanted to understand what was going on, and his patience only increased Selina's guilt. She felt her words hitting him, but she couldn't stop. Finally, she plucked up the courage and said something that had been tormenting her soul for a long time. She admitted that a man appeared in her life who became something more than just an acquaintance for her. Although she did not mention his name, it was obvious to her that Thomas immediately understood who she was talking about. Thomas froze. He wasn't ready for such a confession. Until recently, he thought he could figure out what was going on, that their problems were related to something simpler: fatigue, lack of time for each other. But what Selina said now turned his whole perception upside down. He couldn't believe his ears. It was like a knife that was slowly stabbing into his heart, causing unbearable pain. Thomas tried to collect his thoughts, but they flew in different directions. Selina continued to talk, trying not to look into his eyes. She felt that if she looked at his face, she wouldn't be able to continue. She talked about her feelings, about how she had been fighting with herself for a long time, how she tried to stop it, but in the end, she couldn't resist anymore. She did not say directly that there was something physical between her and Marcus, but she made it clear that their relationship had long crossed the line that could not be crossed. She tried to explain that it wasn't just a weakness or a fleeting attraction, but something more that couldn't be controlled. Thomas slowly realized the scale of what had happened. His head was throbbing with shock and anger. He couldn't believe that Selina, his wife, a woman he trusted unconditionally, with whom he was building a family, could do this. But what was even scarier was that this man was his own son. How could this happen? How could they let this happen? Thomas couldn't find an answer, and that made the pain even more unbearable. When Selina stopped talking, there was an oppressive silence in the room. Thomas sat motionless, unable to find the words. His mind was clouded by pain and rage. It seemed to him that the whole world had collapsed on him in an instant. Everything that he had once considered solid and unshakable was on the verge of destruction. Marriage, family, trust, all this was shattered the moment Selina confessed her feelings for Marcus. He slowly got up from the table, feeling his legs give way under the weight of his body. Selina continued to sit in her seat, as if afraid to even move. She knew she had just ruined their lives, but she couldn't change anything. Thomas silently left the room without looking at her. He needed time to process what had happened, but already he knew that their relationship would never be the same. Selina was left alone at the table, feeling the silence of the house pressing down on her from all sides. The internal tension has reached its peak. She realized that the confession did not bring relief, it only started the process of destruction that she had been postponing for so long. It was all over now. After Selina's confession, everything seemed to freeze. Time ceased to matter, and the house, which had once been a place of comfort and safety, became a silent witness to their ruined lives. Marcus had been avoiding the house for a long time, as if he was trying to find a way to deal with what had happened, but inside he already knew he couldn't stay here anymore. Thomas withdrew into himself after the confession. His silence became even more depressing for Selina and Marcus than any screams and reproaches. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to figure out the details, but his presence in the house had become so unbearable that every step of Marcus, every look of Selina echoed heavily in his soul. Thomas seemed to exist in a parallel reality, where everything that was happening seemed to him only a nightmare from which he could not wake up. Marcus, despite all his inner chaos, knew that the situation couldn't go on like this. He was tormented by guilt in front of his father, who suddenly became a stranger. Thomas had always been a pillar of support for him, a person he could rely on in difficult moments, but now, standing in front of this silent, cold man, Marcus couldn't even look him in the eye. It seemed to him that every day the walls of the house were shrinking more and more, and the oppressive atmosphere was tearing him apart from the inside. He felt like a traitor, and the feeling was becoming unbearable. Guilt in front of her father and in front of Selina herself made their every joint presence in the house an unbearable ordeal. He could no longer be under the same roof with Thomas, unable to stand his silent condemnation, even if it was not spoken out loud. Marcus realized that the only way out for him was to escape. An escape from everything, from the pain, from his feelings, from the disaster that he and Selina had created. When the decision was made, it took Marcus a long time to gather the strength to tell Selina about it. He felt that with this step he was breaking a connection that for a long time had been the only source of meaning for him, even if it was forbidden and destructive. However, he understood that their relationship could not continue. He knew that if he stayed, he would continue to destroy not only his own life, but also the lives of those around him. Selina had been living on a powder keg all this time, afraid of Marcus's every move, afraid of his departure, but even more afraid of his presence. After confessing to Thomas, her inner world collapsed completely. She had lost control of her life, and now her existence was saturated with hopelessness and despair. Every day in this house was torture for her. Thomas no longer spoke to her, did not seek explanations, but his silence tore her heart. Her love for him remained deeply hidden under a layer of guilt and shame, but it was even more painful to realize that she had lost Marcus too. When Marcus approached her for the last time, his face was cold and closed. He didn't want to show her his pain, but Selina, knowing him, saw that everything was falling apart in him too. He couldn't stay. It was the end that they both foresaw, but could not prevent. He left the house in silence, without saying goodbye to his father, only leaving a brief message where he announced his decision to leave. Selina didn't stop him. She knew it was inevitable. When the door closed behind Marcus, Selina felt an emptiness she had never known before. It was like losing everything she once had. She was left alone in a house that now seemed strange to her. Everything she had once loved, everything she had built and believed in, had collapsed. The marriage she was trying to save became a barren void. Her relationship with Marcus, despite all its pain and inconsistency, was something real, but now it wasn't either. Thomas couldn't forgive her betrayal. He no longer trusted her, and their stay together under the same roof became just an empty formality. They became strangers, living in the same house, but having nothing in common. Thomas avoided talking, avoided any attempt to figure out the situation. It was too painful for him. His silent suffering became unbearable for Selina. She felt like she was gradually losing herself, staying in this house, which was now full of memories and broken hopes. The nights became a real torment for her. She lay in bed, listening to the quiet sounds in the house, knowing that Thomas would never return to her as before. Their marriage was completely ruined, but Selina couldn't leave. She was paralyzed by her inner conflict, not knowing how to continue living after everything that had happened. Her thoughts kept returning to Marcus. She replayed over and over in her head the moments of their meetings, their looks that said more than words. She knew that it was a mistake, that their feelings should not have developed, but still she could not get rid of the feeling that she had lost not only her husband, but also the only person to whom she had been truly attached in recent months. Left alone, Selina plunged into a deep emotional crisis. She has lost the meaning of life. What seemed important before has become empty and meaningless. She no longer found solace in housework, gardening, or other activities that had once helped her to distract herself. Every corner of the house reminded her of what she had lost. She walked around the rooms like a ghost, not knowing what to do next. Her whole life had collapsed, and she had nothing left to return to. Thomas, despite his outward composure, was also suffering. He couldn't forgive Selina for her betrayal, couldn't forgive Marcus for destroying their family. It seemed to him that all these years he had been living in an illusion, not noticing how everything was gradually falling apart. Now that the truth has come out, his world has crumbled into pieces. Every day he returned to the house, which had become for him a place of pain, not comfort. He no longer tried to establish a relationship with Selina, realizing that this was impossible. For Selina, life turned into an endless series of monotonous days filled with silence and loneliness. She lost everything, her family and herself. Her inner world was destroyed, and she saw no way out of this situation. Her love for Marcus had been forbidden and destructive, but now that he wasn't around, she realized how deep her feelings ran. She couldn't go back to her old life, she couldn't reconnect with Thomas, but she also couldn't leave this house, which had become a prison for her. Every day she tried to find the strength to move on, but each time she returned to the thought that she had lost everything that was once important to her. She felt lost, as if her soul had been left in the past, where Marcus and Thomas were still. Loneliness became her constant companion, and the silence of the house was her only consolation. Marcus drove far away from this place, trying to forget everything that happened. But he couldn't completely get rid of his guilt either. It seemed to him that he had lost forever, not only his father, but also the part of himself that he had found in his relationship with Selina. He tried to start a new life, but the memories of it continued to haunt him, preventing him from moving on. Running away did not bring him release, only temporary relief from the pain. Selina, on the other hand, remained locked in her inner world, full of regrets and ruined hopes. She lost her family, her love, her self-confidence, and the worst part was that she no longer knew how to start all over again. After Marcus left and broke up with Thomas, Selina's life turned into a series of joyless days filled with the weight of lost relationships, pain and guilt. She was desperately trying to rebuild her life, at least to give the appearance that she was still in control of what was happening. However, her every effort ran into an impenetrable wall, a wall built from her own mistakes, regrets, and shattered hopes. The house that had once been her refuge, her private corner of tranquility, was now the epitome of everything she had lost. It had seemed like a fortress to her before, protecting her from the outside world, but now its walls pressed down on her, reminding her that everything she created here was an illusion. In every corner, in every room, in every object, Selina saw traces of the past, where Thomas and Marcus were still, where she lived in the shadow of forbidden feelings and guilt. From the very beginning, she knew that attempts to return to her old life would be futile. Nevertheless, she continued to do what she had always done. She tended the garden, cooked the food, as if Thomas was about to return from work, and they would sit down at the table, as it was before. But every time she set the table, when she sat down to dinner alone, she was overcome by a strange, suffocating feeling of emptiness. Thomas couldn't forgive her. Despite his efforts to remain restrained, his pain, anger, and resentment were too great to be ignored. After her confession, their relationship finally fell apart. Everything that connected them, the past, shared memories, their marriage was destroyed. Thomas did not reprimand her or accuse her directly. He just drifted away. Every day his silence became more deafening, and soon it turned into an insurmountable wall between them. Selina understood that she had destroyed not only the marriage, but also the trust they had built over the years. Their relationship was empty and cold, like a shell with nothing left alive inside. Thomas no longer looked at her with the love she had once seen in his eyes. Now his gaze was full of disappointment and detachment. He began to come home later, and then he began to stay at work until late at night, as if avoiding returning to the house, which became a symbol of his betrayal. Selina saw that he was no longer trying to save their marriage. No matter how much she wanted to fix everything, to bring everything back, she knew that this path was already closed. Their lives turned into an existence next to each other, but not together, They were no longer partners, no longer family. Selina continued to live in this house, as if fulfilling the punishment for her mistakes, facing the ghosts of the past every day. She was plagued by a constant sense of guilt that she could not banish from her soul. Even when she was trying to do the usual things like gardening or reading, her thoughts kept returning to Marcus. She couldn't forget his look, his words, his touch. The guilt of dragging him into this forbidden affair weighed on her. She knew that his departure was the result of her weakness, her inability to cope with her own feelings. She understood that she had ruined not only her own life, but also the lives of Marcus and Thomas. And this knowledge was unbearable for her. Every day Selina woke up with the feeling that her life had turned into an endless series of empty, monotonous days. She tried to get back to her old routine, but it didn't bring her any comfort. Everything seemed meaningless, as if her life had lost its colors, and all that remained were the shadows of the past that followed her relentlessly. Selina was trying to find a way out, trying to restore at least part of her life. She considered leaving this house, starting all over again in another place, away from those memories that tormented her so much. But it wasn't that easy. She felt that by leaving home, she would finally lose all connection with what had been her life before. This house was not just a place, it was a symbol of her love for Thomas, their family, their hopes. And although those hopes were dashed, she couldn't leave them behind. Selina tried to return to public life, see friends, go shopping or take walks around the city. But each time it brought only short-term relief. She felt like a stranger among people, as if her own soul was so broken that she could no longer fit into the world around her. Every time she met someone, she was reminded of how far she had moved away from the life she had once led. She was tormented by the thought that she would never be able to return to her former state, that her life had been changed forever. Every day Selina became more and more immersed in her own thoughts and memories. She spent long hours alone, wandering around the house or garden, trying to find some solace in it. But instead, her thoughts returned to what had been lost. Every time she passed Marcus's bedroom, or the bedroom she shared with Thomas, she felt a sense of hopelessness. She realized that these places would never be the same again. They now held not only happy memories, but also the shadow of her betrayal. Selina realized that her marriage with Thomas was finally falling apart. Even if he never directly told her about it, she knew that their relationship was already dead. They lived under the same roof, but there was no longer any intimacy or trust between them. They became two strangers who only formally continued to exist in the same space. Thomas no longer tried to understand her, and she could no longer explain her actions. They had nothing to say to each other. Sometimes she saw Thomas packing up to leave again for a business trip or a long meeting. There was no longer the lightness and confidence in his movements that had once attracted her. He moved like a man carrying a heavy burden, and that burden was her betrayal. Every time he left the house, she felt that this might be the last time, that one day he just wouldn't come back. And each time this thought became more likely. The final scene of the collapse of their marriage took place so quietly that Selina herself barely noticed how it ended. Thomas packed up his things and left without saying a word. It was expected, but it still hurt. She was not at home when he finally left her, and when she returned, his belongings were gone, as was he. There was no note, no explanation. He just walked away, leaving only a void in his wake. Selina was left alone in a house that once seemed like a salvation to her. Now he was a symbol of ruined lives and unfulfilled hopes for her. Every room, everything reminded her of what had been and what could have been. There was no more laughter, joy, or warmth in this house. He had become an empty shell, just like her. Selina knew that her life would never be the same. She has lost everything: love, family, self-confidence. Now she was alone, and her future seemed as empty to her as the house she had left behind.